Morgan's face flushed. "You're twisting my words. I was acting to protect the integrity of our premium cabin." The passenger was clearly out of place. Out of place, James repeated, writing the phrase down deliberately. "And what in your professional assessment makes someone out of place in first class?" Morgan hesitated, suddenly aware of the trap. "It's not about race, if that's what you're implying. It's about presentation behavior, the whole package." James leaned forward. "Ms. Bennett, we've received detailed accounts of this incident from multiple sources, including Purser Rodriguez and passenger Thomas Blackwell. These accounts describe behavior that violates no fewer than 6 specific company policies regarding passenger treatment and non-discrimination." "This is absurd," Morgan protested, her composure beginning to crack. "I've been with Pinnacle for 22 years. I know how to manage my cabin. That girl was trying to access a seat she didn't belong in, and I addressed it appropriately." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "That girl, as you call her, was Jasmine Williams, daughter of Jackson Williams, CEO and founder of Pinnacle Airways." The color drained from Morgan's face. "What? The corporate account you found so suspicious, that was the CEO's family account." James explained, his tone clinical. "The passenger you deemed out of place in first class was the daughter of the man who owns the airline." Morgan's mouth opened and closed several times, no words emerging. The implications crashed over her in devastating waves. This is a mistake," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea." "How was I supposed to know?" "That's precisely the point," Ms. Bennett Elizabeth replied sharply. "You weren't supposed to know. No crew member should treat any passenger differently based on who they are or who you think they are. Your actions revealed a pattern of judgment and bias that is fundamentally at odds with Pinnacle's values." Morgan's breathing quickened, panic setting in. It was one mistake. 22 years of service, and you're going to fire me over one misunderstanding. James slid a document across the table. "This isn't about one incident, Ms. Bennett. Your personnel file contains 7 passenger complaints over the past 2 years alleging similar treatment, predominantly involving younger passengers and people of color. Each was dismissed as a misunderstanding after review by your regional manager." "Those complaints were resolved," Morgan protested. "William always understood that some passengers make frivolous claims when they don't get their way. William Reynolds will be addressing his own role in this pattern separately," Elizabeth stated coldly. "But today we're focused on your actions." She placed another document on the table. A termination letter, the Pinnacle Airways logo stark at the top of the page. "Morgan Bennett, effective immediately. Your employment with Pinnacle Airways is terminated for gross misconduct. This includes discriminatory behavior toward a passenger, abuse of authority, and filing a false in-flight report." Morgan stared at the letter, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. 22 years. Gone in an instant. "You can't do this," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "My whole career. My pension. Please." "It was one mistake." "It wasn't one mistake," James corrected her firmly. "It was a revealing moment that brought to light a pattern of behavior incompatible with our company's standards." Elizabeth stood. "You will surrender your company identification uniform items and all access credentials before leaving this room. Your final paycheck will be processed according to company policy. Your flight privileges are permanently revoked." "But how will I get home?" Morgan asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "That is no longer Pinnacle Airways' concern," Elizabeth replied. "Mr. Montez will escort you to collect your belongings from the crew hotel, after which you will need to make your own arrangements." A memory flashed through Morgan's mind, a young black woman she'd redirected to economy 2 years ago, who had tearfully asked the same question. "How will I get home?" Morgan had dismissed her concerns with cold efficiency. Now the tables had turned, and she found herself equally unprepared, equally vulnerable. "What about due process?" Morgan asked, grasping at procedural straws. "Don't I have the right to defend myself, to present my side of the story?" "You've had the opportunity to explain your actions," James said. "Your explanations only confirmed what the evidence already showed. You made assumptions based on appearance and acted on those assumptions despite clear evidence to the contrary." Morgan's hands shook as she reached for the termination letter. "This can't be happening. My husband, our mortgage. I can't just lose everything over one incident." "Consider for a moment," Elizabeth said, her voice slightly softer, but no less firm, what Jasmine Williams lost during that flight. Her dignity, her comfort, her right to be treated with basic respect. The difference is, she did nothing to deserve that loss. As Morgan processed these words, a new emotion began to surface beneath the panic and self-pity, the faint stirring of shame. Not just at being caught, but at the growing recognition that what she had done was fundamentally wrong. Can I at least apologize to her?" Morgan asked, a last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. Elizabeth's expression remained unmoved. "Ms. Williams has already departed the airport. And frankly, Ms. Bennett, an apology motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse would serve no purpose other than to ease your conscience." As Rafael Montez stepped forward to collect her credentials, Morgan Bennett sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the true cost of her prejudice. She had tried to gatekeep the front of the plane only to find herself permanently barred from the entire airline. The karma wasn't just swift. It was absolute, and in the quiet moments that followed as she surrendered her wings pin and company ID, a question began to form in her mind, one that would haunt her in the weeks to come. How many other passengers had she judged dismissed or humiliated based on the same flawed assumptions? And how many of those passengers hadn't had a CEO father to ensure justice was served? In the tranquil elegance of the Windsor suite, the chaos of Heathrow's main terminals felt a world away. The room's soft lighting, leather furnishings, and subtle artwork created an atmosphere of exclusive calm. A spread of fresh pastries, fruit, and coffee had been arranged on a sideboard, though neither Jasmine nor Jackson had shown much interest in the refreshments. They sat in plush armchairs angled toward each other, the morning light streaming through tinted windows that overlooked the bustling tarmac below. Jackson listened intently as Jasmine recounted the full experience of her flight, from the initial confrontation with Morgan to the quiet acts of kindness from Camila and Marco. "The worst part wasn't even being moved to the back," Jasmine explained, cradling a cup of untouched tea. "It was the way she looked at me, like my very presence in first class was suspicious, like I was trying to cheat the system somehow." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing his daughter to express her feelings without interruption. "And then there was the walk," she continued, her voice quieter now. "Being paraded past all those passengers in business class, everyone wondering what I'd done wrong. I kept my head up, but inside." She trailed off, shaking her head. "The dreams came back last night," she admitted after a moment, setting down her teacup. "The ones where I'm running down hallways that never end. The ones where everyone's staring, but I can't find the exit." Jackson reached across to take her hand, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in her voice. These were the dreams she'd had as a child, after similar experiences. Dreams he'd hoped she might outgrow, but knew she probably never would, in a world that continued to question her belonging. "You shouldn't have had to endure any of it," Jackson said finally. His voice controlled but edged with anger. "It represents a failure at every level, from individual judgment to company oversight." Jasmine studied her father's face. "What's happening to her?" "To Morgan. She's being terminated," Jackson replied simply. "Effective immediately." Jasmine nodded slowly. She had expected as much but found no satisfaction in the knowledge. "And then what? We fire one flight attendant, and everything's fixed. A small, proud smile touched Jackson's lips. His daughter had always possessed an ability to see beyond immediate reactions to underlying structures. It was what made her interest in architecture so fitting. "No," he acknowledged. "That's just the beginning. We have a much deeper problem to address." He reached for his tablet and pulled up the document he'd been working on during his flight. "I've been developing something I'm tentatively calling the Jasmine Initiative, a comprehensive approach to identifying and eliminating bias throughout our operations." Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. "You named it after me. If you're comfortable with that," he replied. "Though we can certainly choose another name." "No, it's fine," she said quickly, then laughed softly. "Actually, it's more than fine. It's meaningful." She hesitated. "I was working on something similar during the flight, a training program focused on dignity and respect." Jackson's eyebrows rose. "Show me." Jasmine pulled her sketchbook from her backpack and opened it to the pages she'd filled during the long hours in seat 47E. Jackson leaned forward, scanning the detailed notes and diagrams his daughter had created. "This is remarkable," he said after a moment, genuine admiration in his voice. "You've addressed several angles I hadn't even considered. I was thinking about it from a spatial perspective," Jasmine explained, pointing to one of her diagrams. "How physical environments signal who belongs and who doesn't. A first-class cabin is designed to be exclusive, but that exclusivity shouldn't be based on anything but the price of the ticket. That's exactly the kind of insight we need," Jackson agreed. "Most corporate training focuses on what people say or do not, how spaces themselves can reinforce bias." They began comparing notes, father and daughter finding common ground in their shared vision for change. Despite the circumstances that had brought them to this moment, there was something healing in the collaborative energy between them. Before Jasmine could respond, there was a discreet knock at the door. A staff member entered and whispered something to Jackson, who nodded in acknowledgement. "Mr. Blackwell has arrived," Jackson explained to Jasmine. "I asked if he would be willing to speak with us before he leaves the airport." Moments later, Thomas Blackwell was shown into the suite. He was tall and distinguished, his tailored suit showing minimal signs of the transatlantic journey. His expression was serious but not unfriendly as he approached. "Mr. Williams," he said, extending his hand. "Thomas Blackwell. Though under better circumstances, I would have preferred a different introduction to Pinnacle's CEO." Jackson shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, Mr. Blackwell. This is my daughter Jasmine." Thomas turned to Jasmine with a respectful nod. "Ms. Williams. First, let me say how sorry I am for what you experienced. It was completely unacceptable." "Thank you," Jasmine replied. "And thank you for speaking up. Camila mentioned you provided a statement." "I did?" Thomas confirmed, accepting the seat Jackson offered him. "In my position, I've learned that documentation is essential when addressing instances of misconduct." "Your statement was incredibly helpful," Jackson said. "Precise, detailed, and objective." Thomas's expression darkened slightly. "Unfortunately, I've had practice. What happened to your daughter wasn't an isolated incident. I've witnessed similar treatment on other airlines and occasionally even on Pinnacle flights, though never quite so blatant." Even as an executive with platinum status, Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. Status, helps Thomas acknowledged with a wry smile. "But it doesn't erase all preconceptions. I still get the occasional, 'Are you sure you're in the right line?' at priority boarding, or the surprised look when I'm upgraded to first class." Jasmine nodded in recognition. "It's exhausting always having to prove you belong in spaces where others are simply assumed to belong." "Exactly," Thomas agreed. "For what it's worth, you handled yourself with remarkable poise. Many adults with far more experience wouldn't have maintained such dignity." He turned to Jackson. "I've been thinking about this situation since it happened, about what it represents and what might be done to address it. I'd like to hear your thoughts." Jackson replied, genuinely interested in this perspective, from someone who had witnessed the incident firsthand. It seems to me, Thomas began thoughtfully, that what happened to Jasmine is a symptom of a much larger issue in the airline industry, and frankly in most customer service environments. Staff are trained to enforce policies and protect exclusive spaces, but they're rarely taught to examine the assumptions that inform their enforcement decisions. Exactly, Jasmine interjected, leaning forward. It becomes about who looks like they belong rather than who actually has the right to be there. Thomas nodded. And when those assumptions go unchallenged, they become entrenched. They become policy in all but name. Jackson watched this exchange with growing resolve. This wasn't just about his daughter or one flight attendant's bias. This was about a pervasive reality that affected countless passengers every day, regardless of their connections or status. Mr. Blackwell Jackson said after a moment, "I'm planning a major overhaul of our training and accountability systems to address these issues more effectively. Would you be interested in lending your perspective to that effort?" Perhaps as a member of a newly formed passenger advocacy board, Thomas appeared genuinely surprised by the offer. "That's not what I expected when I agreed to this meeting," he admitted. "But yes, I would be interested. On one condition. And that is that it's not just window dressing," Thomas said directly. "I've seen too many corporations launch initiatives with great fanfare only to quietly abandon them when media attention fades or costs mount." "I can assure you," Jackson replied with equal directness, "this will not be a public relations exercise. The changes we implement will be substantial, measurable, and permanent." Thomas studied Jackson's face for a moment, then nodded. "In that case, I'm in. My assistant will be shocked I typically avoid committee work like the plague." This drew a small laugh from both Williams. The tension in the room had eased, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Now, Jackson said, gesturing to the untouched breakfast spread, "Can I offer either of you something to eat, Jasmine? You must be starving after that flight." "Actually, I am," she admitted. "Airline food in economy is even worse than I remembered." As they helped themselves to the fresh pastries and fruit, the conversation turned to more immediate matters: Jasmine's program at Oxford Thomas's business in London, the logistics of getting Jasmine settled in her accommodation. But beneath this ordinary exchange ran a current of significance. In this quiet VIP suite, far from corporate boardrooms and press conferences, a coalition was forming, one that would soon reshape not just Pinnacle Airways, but potentially the standards of the entire industry. "One last thing before we part ways," Jackson said as their meeting drew to a close. "Morgan Bennett has been terminated effective immediately. But I want you both to understand that I see her actions as symptomatic of deeper issues within our company culture. The real work is just beginning." Jasmine nodded, meeting her father's eyes with understanding. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." 1 week later, the Pinnacle Airways boardroom in New York hummed with tension. The long mahogany table was surrounded by the 12 board members, their expressions ranging from concerned to openly hostile. Jackson Williams stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. On the wall-mounted screen behind him was the first slide of his presentation, "The Jasmine Initiative, Transforming Company Culture from the Ground Up." "Ladies and gentlemen," Jackson began, his voice measured but resolute, "thank you for convening this emergency session. As you're all aware, a serious incident occurred on flight PA438 last week, involving my daughter Jasmine Williams." He proceeded to outline the events clinically and precisely, avoiding emotional language, but sparing no detail. The faces on screen grew increasingly grave as he described Morgan Bennett's actions, the subsequent investigation, and the immediate termination. William Reynolds, a silver-haired veteran of the industry with a perpetual frown, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been unusually quiet during the preliminary discussions, perhaps aware that his role in dismissing previous complaints against Bennett had already been noted. While I recognize that swift action was necessary in this case, Reynolds finally interjected when Jackson paused. I'm concerned about the precedent we're setting. Firing a long-serving employee without a formal investigation period feels reactionary. Jackson's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened slightly. Ms. Bennett's conduct was documented by multiple witnesses, including the purser and a high-status passenger. But more importantly, William, this isn't an isolated incident. With a few keystrokes, Jackson shared a spreadsheet on the screen. This is a compilation of passenger complaints involving alleged discriminatory treatment over the past 2 years. You'll note that 73% were dismissed after cursory investigation, primarily by regional managers. The board members leaned closer to their screens, scanning the data with growing discomfort. And if you sort by the manager who handled the investigation, Jackson continued highlighting a column, you'll find that you, William, personally dismissed 18 complaints, including 3 against Morgan Bennett. Reynolds' face flushed with anger. Those complaints were meritless. Passengers routinely exaggerate when they don't get their way. Perhaps some do, Jackson acknowledged. But when we see patterns, the same flight attendants, the same types of passengers, the same dismissive responses we have to question whether our investigation process itself is compromised. Gabriela Hernandez, one of the newer board members, spoke up. Jackson, these numbers are disturbing. What are you proposing? Jackson shifted to a new document, the outline of the Jasmine initiative he had drafted during his flight. I'm proposing a comprehensive overhaul of our hiring, training, evaluation, and accountability processes. This incident has exposed fundamental flaws in our approach to diversity and inclusion, flaws that not only hurt our passengers but ultimately damage our brand and business. He detailed the key components: enhanced bias training for all customer-facing staff, a restructured complaint investigation process with external oversight, anonymous testing using passengers of various demographics, revised performance metrics that incorporated equitable treatment, and a new passenger advocacy board with representation from diverse backgrounds. The implementation will require significant resources, he concluded. I'm allocating an initial $25 million to this initiative, and I'm prepared to increase that figure if necessary. William Reynolds scoffed audibly. $25 million because one flight attendant made a bad call. This is precisely the kind of emotional overreaction I was concerned about. Michael Washington, who had been silent until now, removed his glasses deliberately. William, with respect, I think you're missing the point. This isn't about one flight attendant or one incident. This is about recognizing that our current systems are inadequate. Exactly, Gabriela Hernandez agreed. And frankly, as the only Hispanic woman on this board, I can tell you that what happened to Jasmine Williams isn't surprising to me. It's just that most passengers who experience this kind of treatment don't have direct access to the CEO. Reynolds's expression darkened further. So we're going to restructure our entire operation based on anecdotal complaints. This feels like a solution in search of a problem. I have the data right here, Jackson replied calmly, highlighting another section of the spreadsheet. In the past year, we've received over 300 complaints specifically mentioning discriminatory treatment. Of those, only 11 resulted in any substantive action. That's not anecdotal, William. That's a pattern. Reynolds shook his head stubbornly. Passengers complain about everything these days. If we chase down every grievance... This isn't about every grievance. Jackson interrupted his patience, visibly thinning. This is about a specific category of complaints that point to a fundamental failure in our service model. When passengers are being treated differently based on how they look rather than their ticketed status, we have a serious problem. The tension in the room was palpable now. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing the growing rift between Jackson and Reynolds. William Jackson continued, his voice level again. I understand your concerns about cost and process, but I want you to consider something. What happened to my daughter wasn't just a bad call. It was a revealing moment that exposed flaws in how we train our staff, how we investigate complaints, and how we hold people accountable for upholding our values. Reynolds appeared unmoved. Values are important, Jackson, but they don't pay the bills. This initiative is going to drain resources, distract from operational priorities, and potentially alienate staff who feel they're being unfairly scrutinized. Jackson leaned forward, his calm demeanor giving way to a rare flash of intensity. William, let me be absolutely clear. This is not up for debate. I've shared these plans with you as a courtesy, but I am moving forward with or without board approval. A tense silence fell over the virtual meeting. However, Jackson continued, his voice level again. I would prefer to have your support. This isn't just about doing what's right, though. That would be reason enough. It's about protecting and strengthening our business. Every passenger who experiences discrimination becomes not just a lost customer, but an advocate against our brand. The board members exchanged glances, the weight of the decision evident in their expressions. I'd like to call for a vote, Gabriella suggested, to formally endorse the Jasmine initiative and allocate the requested resources. Reynolds made one final attempt. This is being rushed. We should form a committee to study the issue more thoroughly before committing such significant resources. Michael Washington shook his head. With respect, William, that approach, forming committees, conducting studies, delaying action, is precisely how institutions perpetuate the status quo. I second Gabriella's motion for an immediate vote. The board secretary called the roll. One by one, the members voiced their positions. When the final vote was tallied, the result was clear: 10 in favor, 1 abstention, and 1 opposed, William Reynolds standing alone in his resistance. The motion carries, the secretary announced formally. The board endorses the implementation of the Jasmine initiative and the allocation of designated funds. Jackson nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Thank you for your support. I'll provide weekly progress reports as we move forward. As the meeting concluded and most members signed off, Reynolds remained, his expression a mixture of frustration and calculation. You're making a mistake, Jackson, he said once they were alone on the video call. This isn't about improving service. It's about imposing a political agenda on a business that should be focused on operational excellence. Jackson studied the man he'd once considered a mentor, now revealed as the guardian of a status quo that had failed too many passengers. William, he replied evenly, I've always respected your business acumen. But in this case, you're wrong. This isn't political. It's personal, not just for me and Jasmine, but for every passenger who's ever been made to feel they don't belong in a seat they paid for. Reynolds' expression hardened. This won't end here, you know. The board may have rolled over today, but there will be pushback. From staff, from management, from shareholders who question why we're spending millions on sensitivity training instead of fleet expansion. I'm counting on it, Jackson said, surprising the older man. Because that pushback will reveal exactly where the resistance to change lives in our organization. And once it's visible, it can be addressed. He leaned closer to the camera. You built an airline that prioritized profit over people, William. I'm rebuilding one that recognizes we can't have one without the other. Without waiting for a response, Jackson ended the call. The screen went black, reflecting his own image back at him, determined, resolute, and fully aware that the real battle was just beginning. The vote was a victory, but it was only the first step in a much longer journey. Changing policies was relatively straightforward. Changing hearts and minds would be far more challenging. His phone buzzed with a message from Jasmine. How did the board meeting go? He typed a simple reply. They're on board. The real work begins now. Her response came seconds later. I never doubted it. You're Jackson Williams. Making the impossible happen is what you do. A small smile touched his lips. For all her precociousness, there were moments when Jasmine still viewed him with a child's unshakable faith. He only hoped he could live up to that faith in the months ahead. 2 weeks later, the main auditorium at Pinnacle Airways London headquarters was filled to capacity. Employees from every department and level of the organization sat in attentive silence as Jasmine Williams took the stage. The event was being live-streamed to all Pinnacle facilities worldwide, ensuring that every employee from baggage handlers in Singapore to reservation agents in Sao Paulo could witness this moment. Jackson stood at the podium, his presence commanding even without the microphone that carried his voice to thousands of employees across the globe. "Good morning," he began, his tone measured and deliberate. 2 weeks ago, an incident occurred on Pinnacle Flight PA438 from New York to London that has forced us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Despite our stated values and policies, discrimination still exists within our company. A murmur rippled through the audience. While rumors had circulated about a high-profile termination, most employees weren't aware of the full story. A young woman was removed from her assigned first-class seat and relocated to the back of the aircraft. The flight attendant responsible claimed security concerns, but the evidence clearly showed that the passenger was targeted because of her age, her casual attire, and, let's be honest, the color of her skin. Jackson paused, letting the gravity of the statement sink in. What makes this story noteworthy isn't just that it happened, but that our systems failed at every level. The purser's concerns were ignored. Previous complaints against this employee had been dismissed. A culture of silence and acquiescence had developed that allowed bias to flourish unchecked. He looked out at the sea of faces, his expression resolute. "I could stand here and tell you that this was an isolated incident, a single bad actor who has since been removed. But that would be a lie. The truth is far more challenging. This incident exposed deep flaws in our hiring practices, our training protocols, our accountability structures, and our corporate culture." The silence in the auditorium was absolute, now hundreds of employees hanging on every word. "Today, I'm announcing the most significant operational transformation in Pinnacle's history. We're calling it the Jasmine Initiative, named for the passenger who experienced this treatment, and who, I should add, happens to be my daughter." A collective gasp swept through the room. This revelation added a personal dimension that no one had anticipated. "But make no mistake," Jackson continued, "this initiative isn't about special treatment for one passenger. It's about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their appearance, age, or background, receives the respect and dignity they deserve." He outlined the key components of the initiative, his voice gaining strength and conviction with each point. "First, we're implementing a comprehensive retraining program for all customer-facing staff. This isn't the perfunctory online module you click through during your annual review. This is an immersive scenario-based program developed in consultation with leading experts in diversity and inclusion. Second, we're overhauling our complaint investigation process. From now on, all allegations of discriminatory treatment will be reviewed by an independent panel that includes external advocates and representatives from diverse backgrounds. Third, we're establishing a new executive position, Chief Dignity Officer. This person will report directly to me and will have broad authority to implement and enforce our non-discrimination policies across all departments and regions. As Jackson continued detailing the initiative, the cameras captured the various reactions throughout the audience. Some employees nodded in agreement, others looked uncomfortable, and a few appeared openly skeptical. I'm pleased to announce that Camila Rodriguez, formerly a purser on our transatlantic routes, will be promoted to Director of Cabin Culture. In this role, she'll oversee the implementation of our new training protocols and serve as a direct advocate for flight crew concerns. In the front row, Camila sat straighter, surprise and pride evident in her expression. She had expected recognition for her actions on PA438, but nothing of this magnitude. Additionally, we're recognizing junior flight attendant Marco Santos with our inaugural Courage Award for his decision to provide assistance to a passenger in need, even when it meant challenging a superior's questionable directive. A spotlight found Marco in the audience, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and pride as his colleagues applauded. But perhaps most importantly, Jackson continued, once the applause subsided, we're creating a new passenger advocacy board comprised of frequent flyers from diverse backgrounds who will provide ongoing feedback on our practices and policies. I'm honored to announce that Thomas Blackwell, Executive Vice President at Meridian Global, has agreed to serve as the inaugural chairperson of this board. Thomas, seated in the VIP section, nodded in acknowledgement as the cameras found him. Now I know that change is difficult. Jackson acknowledged, his tone softening slightly. Some of you may be wondering why we need such sweeping reforms. Others may feel that we're overreacting to a single incident. I understand those concerns. He stepped away from the podium, moving to the center of the stage to address the audience more directly. But I want you to consider this. For every incident that comes to light, how many go unreported? For every passenger with a direct line to the CEO, how many simply vow never to fly with us again? And most importantly, what is the human cost of allowing these patterns to continue? The auditorium remained silent, the weight of these questions settling over the assembled employees. This initiative will require substantial investment, $25 million initially, with more to follow as needed. It will demand time, energy, and a willingness to examine uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our institution. But I believe it's not just the right thing to do morally. It's essential for our long-term success as a business. Jackson returned to the podium for his conclusion. Pinnacle Airways was founded on a simple promise to provide exceptional service to every passenger on every flight every day. Today, we're recommitting ourselves to that promise not just in words, but in concrete actions that will transform how we operate at every level. The journey ahead won't be easy. Change rarely is. But I'm asking each of you to join me in building an airline where dignity isn't a luxury reserved for certain passengers, but the foundation of everything we do. As Jackson finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause, tentative at first, then building to a thunderous ovation. Not every employee was equally enthusiastic. Cameras caught William Reynolds in the executive section clapping with visible reluctance. But the overall response was clear. The majority of Pinnacle's workforce was ready for change. After the presentation, media outlets worldwide picked up the story. Initial coverage focused on the shock value CEO's daughter humiliated by airline staff, but quickly evolved into deeper analysis of the initiative itself. Industry experts debated whether such extensive reforms were necessary or sustainable, while diversity advocates hailed Pinnacle as setting a new standard for corporate accountability. Within days, competing airlines began reviewing their own training and complaint procedures, aware that the spotlight that had found Pinnacle could easily shift their way. For Jasmine Williams, watching the ripple effects spread through the industry, the public response was secondary. What mattered most was the text he received from Jasmine that evening after the announcement. Watched your speech online. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. This is exactly what I hoped for. Not just consequences for one person, but real change for everyone. This is what leadership looks like. Those words, more than the board's approval or the media's praise, told him he was on the right path. Part 4. The Transformation. The ancient spires of Oxford University reached toward a cloudless June sky as Jasmine Williams made her way across the cobblestone courtyard of Magdalen College. 3 weeks had passed since the incident on flight PA-438, and while the memory hadn't faded, it no longer dominated her thoughts. Instead, she found herself absorbed in the summer program that had brought her to this historic institution, the intensive study of architectural history that would lay the groundwork for her undergraduate studies in the fall. The lecture hall for today's session was housed in a building that dated back to the 15th century, its stone walls almost humming with centuries of accumulated knowledge. Jasmine settled into her seat, pulling out her notebook and the well-worn copy of the 4 books of architecture by Palladio that had become her constant companion. Professor Eleanor Hammond entered the room with her characteristic energy, her silver hair swept into an elegant knot, eyes bright with enthusiasm despite her 60-plus years. She had taken a particular interest in Jasmine, recognizing not just her technical talent, but her unique perspective on the relationship between architecture and social dynamics. "Good morning, everyone." Professor Hammond began surveying the 24 students gathered before her. "Today we're continuing our exploration of architectural exclusion, the ways in which the built environment can reinforce social hierarchies and power structures." Jasmine felt a familiar tightening in her chest. The topic hit closer to home than the professor could know. From the imposing facades of government buildings designed to intimidate the common citizen to the subtle ways public spaces can be rendered inhospitable to certain populations, architecture has long been a tool for determining who belongs and who doesn't. As the lecture proceeded, Jasmine found herself viewing the material through the lens of her recent experience. The first-class cabin of an aircraft was in its way an architectural space designed to separate and elevate wide aisles. Private pods, exclusive lavatories, all creating a physical manifestation of status and privilege. When Professor Hammond opened the floor for discussion, Jasmine raised her hand. "Yes, Ms. Williams. I've been thinking about transitional spaces." Jasmine began choosing her words carefully. Places like airport terminals, train stations, and aircraft interiors, spaces that aren't permanent but still communicate powerful messages about inclusion and exclusion. Professor Hammond nodded encouragingly. "An interesting focus. Please elaborate." "These spaces often contain very clear demarcations, physical barriers, separate entrances, restricted zones. But I'm particularly interested in how the human gatekeepers of these spaces can either reinforce or subvert the architectural intent." By gatekeepers, you mean security personnel, receptionists, flight attendants, people whose job involves controlling access to certain spaces. They make judgment calls about who looks like they belong, often based on unexamined biases. A murmur of recognition passed through the classroom. Many students of color nodded in understanding, while some of their white peers listened with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. "That's a fascinating point, Ms. Williams," Professor Hammond said, genuine interest in her voice. "The intersection of architectural design and human judgment creates a complex dynamic of inclusion and exclusion that goes beyond pure physical barriers." After class, Professor Hammond approached Jasmine as she gathered her materials. "Your observations today were quite insightful, Jasmine. Have you considered developing this line of thinking for your final project?" Jasmine hesitated, then decided to share a bit more. "Actually, Professor, my interest isn't purely academic. I recently experienced being judged as out of place in a premium space because of how I looked." Professor Hammond's expression softened with understanding. "I suspected there might be a personal dimension to your comments. Would you be comfortable sharing more over coffee in the college garden?" Jasmine recounted the incident on flight PA438. Professor Hammond listened attentively, asking occasional questions, but mostly allowing Jasmine to tell her story without interruption. "What fascinates me," Jasmine concluded, "is how quickly that flight attendant made assumptions based on my appearance. The first-class cabin was designed to be exclusive, yes, but she added her own layer of gatekeeping based on her idea of who belonged there." "And now your father is implementing this initiative named after you," Professor Hammond mused. "That must feel rather extraordinary." Jasmine smiled slightly. "It's a bit surreal, but what really matters to me is that it's not just about punishing one person. It's about changing the whole structure that allowed it to happen. That's what makes it so interesting from an architectural perspective," Professor Hammond noted. "You're essentially talking about redesigning social systems, not just physical spaces." The conversation sparked something in Jasmine's mind, a connection between her academic interests and the real-world changes her father was implementing. Over the next several days, she began developing a new project, one that went beyond the requirements of her summer program. She called it Architecture of Belonging, a comprehensive study of how physical spaces and human systems interact to create environments of either inclusion or exclusion. Using her sketchbook digital modeling tools and interviews with fellow students from diverse backgrounds, she began documenting how different people experienced the same spaces in dramatically different ways. The architecture library became her sanctuary, where she spent hours researching how spaces had historically been designed to include or exclude certain populations. She discovered that the grand staircases of government buildings weren't just aesthetic choices, but deliberate barriers to those with mobility issues. She studied how certain neighborhoods were designed with inadequate public transportation, effectively isolating lower-income residents. But Jasmine wasn't interested only in identifying problems. She began sketching alternative designs, railway stations where all passengers entered through the same elegant portal rather than separate entrances for different classes. Airport terminals where security was thorough but humane. Aircraft interiors that maintained premium services without creating visible hierarchies of worth. One evening, as she worked late in the design studio, a notification appeared on her tablet, a news alert about Pinnacle Airways. The headline read, "Airline industry takes notice as Pinnacle's Jasmine initiative gains momentum." The article detailed how other major airlines were beginning to examine their own training practices in the wake of Pinnacle's highly publicized reforms. It quoted industry experts who initially dismissed the initiative as an emotional overreaction, but were now acknowledging its potential to set new standards for customer service and inclusion. Jasmine saved the article to her research folder, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. The incident that had left her feeling humiliated and powerless was now catalyzing change far beyond what she could have imagined. It didn't erase the memory of that moment standing in the galley while Morgan Bennett questioned her right to be there, but it transformed its meaning. The dreams still came occasionally, corridors that stretched endlessly, voices whispering just beyond hearing, doors that wouldn't open, but they had lost some of their power. Now, when she woke, instead of the lingering sense of exclusion, she focused on the designs taking shape in her mind, spaces that welcomed rather than rejected. As her project developed, Jasmine began incorporating elements directly inspired by her father's initiative training modules that used architectural visualization to help staff recognize and counter bias, redesigned physical spaces that removed unnecessary barriers, and reporting systems that captured exclusionary experiences before they became patterns. When she presented her work to Professor Hammond, the professor was visibly impressed. "This goes well beyond architectural theory, Jasmine. You've created something that could have real-world applications." "That's my hope," Jasmine acknowledged. "I've been sharing notes with my father as he implements the initiative. He's actually incorporated some of my ideas into the training materials." "You should consider publishing this," Professor Hammond suggested, "perhaps as a case study in the Journal of Inclusive Design. I'd be happy to co-author with you if you're interested." The offer took Jasmine by surprise. "You think it's that significant I do?" The professor confirmed. "What you're proposing isn't just about making spaces more accessible or comfortable. It's about fundamentally rethinking the relationship between physical environments and human dignity. That's revolutionary in its way." As the summer program neared its conclusion, Jasmine found herself transformed not just by the academic experience, but by the unexpected journey that had begun with that confrontation on flight PA-438. What Morgan Bennett had intended as an act of exclusion had instead sparked a creative and intellectual awakening. On her final evening in Oxford, Jasmine sat on a stone bench in the college garden, sketching the ancient walls and archways that had housed scholars for centuries. These spaces had once excluded women and people of color entirely. Now she sat within them as both beneficiary and critic, appreciating their beauty, while imagining how they might evolve to become truly inclusive. Her phone chimed with a video call from her father. When she answered, his face appeared tired but satisfied. The first cohort of flight attendants just completed the new training program, he reported. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. Your architectural perspective made a real difference in how we structured the exercises. I'm glad Jasmine said genuinely pleased. How is William Reynolds handling the changes? Jackson's expression turned wry. Still resistant, but increasingly isolated. When the preliminary customer satisfaction numbers came in showing a 15% improvement, he had less ground to stand on. And the industry response, better than expected. 3 other airlines have reached out about licensing elements of our training program. The ripple effect is beginning. They talked for a while longer about the details of implementation, the challenges, and small victories. It was a conversation between collaborators as much as father and daughter, and Jasmine felt a deep satisfaction in this new dimension of their relationship. As they prepared to end the call, Jackson's expression grew more serious. I received a letter today, he said. From Morgan Bennett. Jasmine's breath caught slightly. What did it say? It was addressed to you, actually. I forwarded it to your email. It's up to you whether you want to read it. After they said their goodbyes, Jasmine sat in the garden for a long time before opening her email. The letter from Morgan was there, its subject line simply, From Morgan Bennett. With a deep breath, she opened it, unsure what to expect. Anger, excuses, self-justification. Instead, she found something more complex and human. Dear Ms. Williams, you don't know me, though. Our brief interaction changed the course of both our lives. My name is Morgan Bennett, and I was the flight attendant who removed you from your seat on Pinnacle Flight PA 438 3 months ago. The letter continued for several paragraphs, neither a simple apology nor a request for forgiveness. It was an attempt to articulate a journey from certainty to doubt, from defensiveness to reflection. I won't claim that I've completely transformed my thinking, Morgan had written toward the end. Change doesn't happen that quickly or easily. But I am beginning to understand how my actions affected you and others like you over the years. I'm starting to see what I couldn't or wouldn't see before. This letter isn't a request for forgiveness or understanding. You owe me neither. It's simply an acknowledgement of harm done and lessons belatedly learned. Jasmine closed the email, her emotions too complex to name. She felt no triumph in Morgan's downfall, no satisfaction in her struggle. But there was a certain peace in knowing that the ripples of change had reached even the person who had initiated this journey. The night before her final presentation, Jasmine received another text from her father. The first group of flight attendants completed the new training program today. Their feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Your contributions made a difference. Proud of you, kiddo. She smiled at the message, then returned to putting the finishing touches on her presentation. Tomorrow, she would share her vision of an architecture that welcomed rather than excluded, that embraced human diversity rather than enforcing narrow definitions of belonging. Morgan Bennett had told her she didn't belong in seat 2A. Now she was redesigning the entire aircraft, metaphorically speaking, so that everyone would belong everywhere. The training room at Pinnacle Airways New York headquarters buzzed with nervous energy as 25 flight attendants ranging from recent hires to veterans with decades of experience settled into their seats. Unlike traditional corporate training sessions with their sterile PowerPoints and role-play exercises, this room had been transformed into something far more immersive. The walls displayed life-sized photographs of diverse passengers, different ages, races, styles of dress abilities. Their expressions captured in moments of uncertainty, hope, anxiety, and expectation. Headphones sat on each desk along with tablets containing the day's materials. Camila Rodriguez, newly appointed Director of Cabin Culture, stood at the front of the room projecting a calm confidence despite the magnitude of what they were undertaking. This was the first full implementation of the Jasmine Initiative's cornerstone training program, and its success or failure would set the tone for everything that followed. Good morning, everyone. Camila began, her voice warm but authoritative. Welcome to the first day of our new dignity-centered service training. This isn't going to be like any corporate training you've experienced before." She gestured to the photographs surrounding them. "These are real Pinnacle passengers photographed during their travels with us. They've agreed to share their stories as part of this program. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge something important. This training might make some of you uncomfortable. It might challenge beliefs you hold or practices you've long considered appropriate. That discomfort is not just normal. It's necessary for genuine growth." A hand went up from the back of the room. It belonged to Kevin Matthews, a senior flight attendant with 18 years of experience, known for his by-the-book approach and occasional resistance to change. "With respect, Camilla," he said, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "We've all had diversity training before. How is this different from the same presentations we sit through every year?" Camilla nodded, having anticipated this question. "Fair point, Kevin. The difference is threefold. First, this isn't a one-day workshop that you'll forget by next week. This is a comprehensive 4-week program with ongoing support and accountability measures. Second, this training was developed with direct input from passengers who have experienced discrimination, airline staff at all levels, and external experts in behavior change, not just corporate compliance officers checking boxes. And third," she added with a slight smile, "there will be no PowerPoints with clip art and bullet points. Instead, you're going to hear directly from passengers through these headphones, experience situations through virtual reality, and engage in candid conversations about real incidents that have occurred on our flights." Kevin seemed slightly mollified, though not entirely convinced. "Now," Camilla continued, "I'd like everyone to put on your headphones. You're about to hear the voice of a passenger describing their experience on a Pinnacle flight 3 months ago. Please, just listen." As the attendants donned their headphones, a young woman's voice filled their ears, measured, articulate, but carrying an undercurrent of hurt. She described boarding a flight, excited for her journey, only to be questioned, doubted, and ultimately removed from her assigned seat, based solely on assumptions about her appearance. Though Jasmine Williams wasn't identified by name, this was her story told in her own words. As the recording played, Camilla watched the expressions of the attendants shift from initial detachment to growing discomfort, and in some cases to recognition and genuine empathy. I kept my head high as I walked through the business-class cabin. Jasmine's voice continued, but inside I felt stripped of my dignity. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about being judged, being found wanting, being told I didn't belong in a space I had every right to occupy. When the audio ended, the room remained silent for several long moments. "That was a real passenger on a real Pinnacle flight," Camilla finally said. "And what happened to her wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of patterns that had been developing and going unchallenged for years." Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I assume this passenger was the CEO's daughter, the one we've heard about." "Yes," Camilla acknowledged, though that's not relevant to the harm she experienced. With respect, Kevin countered, "It seems very relevant. Most passengers don't have a parent who can implement million-dollar training programs when they're treated poorly." Camilla nodded, acknowledging his point. "You're absolutely right, Kevin. Most don't. Which is precisely why this initiative matters so much. For every Jasmine Williams who had a direct line to someone with the power to create change. How many passengers have we lost forever because they were judged excluded or made to feel unwelcome based on their appearance?" The room fell silent again as the implications of this question settled over the group. Over the next 4 weeks, the training progressed from awareness to action. The attendants learned to recognize their own implicit biases, practiced intervention techniques when witnessing problematic behavior from colleagues, and developed strategies for ensuring every passenger felt welcomed and respected. Not everyone embraced the training with equal enthusiasm. Some, like Kevin Matthews, initially bristled at what they perceived as criticism of their professional conduct. Others worried about new expectations, compromising safety protocols, or operational efficiency. I understand the concern Camilla acknowledged during a particularly tense discussion in week 2. But dignity and safety aren't competing priorities, they're complementary. When passengers feel respected and valued, they're actually more likely to comply with safety instructions and cooperate during difficult situations. Gradually, even the most resistant participants began to engage more constructively. The turning point for Kevin came during a session featuring Thomas Blackwell as a guest speaker. As an executive with platinum status, Kevin had assumed Thomas would share his frustration with what some staff viewed as political correctness, interfering with established procedures. Instead, Thomas recounted multiple instances when he had been questioned, redirected, or scrutinized despite his status, expensive suit, and professional demeanor. He described the cumulative psychological toll of constantly having to prove he belonged in spaces where others were automatically welcomed. The thing is, Thomas concluded, looking directly at Kevin, I can handle it. I've developed strategies over the years. But should I have to? Should anyone? And what about the passengers who don't have my resources or position? How many of them simply walk away, never to return to your airline, their dignity bruised, their trust broken? After that session, Kevin approached Camilla. I think I get it now, he admitted. It's not about special treatment for certain passengers. It's about removing the extra barriers some passengers face that others never even see. By the end of the 4 weeks, the transformation was remarkable. The final assessment involved realistic scenarios with actors playing passengers in various situations. Staff who had once relied on rigid procedures and unexamined assumptions now demonstrated flexibility, empathy, and a newfound awareness of how their words and actions impacted passengers' sense of belonging. Meanwhile, across the organization, other aspects of the Jasmine initiative were taking root. The newly established complaint investigation process, overseen by an independent panel that included external advocates, was addressing issues that would previously have been dismissed or buried. The anonymous testing program, using passengers of various demographics to evaluate service consistency, was providing valuable data on areas still needing improvement. Not every change was smooth. Some longtime employees, uncomfortable with the new expectations, chose to leave the company. Others, like William Reynolds, remained but continued to voice skepticism about what they viewed as excessive focus on sensitivity at the expense of operational priorities. During a tense executive meeting 6 weeks into the initiative, Reynolds made his position clear. While I support the general principle of treating all passengers with respect, I'm concerned that we're creating an environment where staff are afraid to enforce necessary rules for fear of being labeled discriminatory. The newly appointed Chief Dignity Officer, Dr. Amara Johnson, a former professor of organizational psychology with extensive experience in corporate transformation, addressed his concern directly. Mr. Reynolds, we're not asking staff to abandon rules or procedures. We're asking them to apply those rules and procedures consistently and without bias. The data we've collected already shows that certain groups of passengers are significantly more likely to be questioned, challenged, or subjected to extra scrutiny than others, even when their behavior is identical. Reynolds remained unconvinced, but his influence was waning as evidence of the initiative's positive impact accumulated. Customer satisfaction scores were rising, particularly among demographics that had historically reported lower ratings. Staff retention was improving in departments that had embraced the changes most fully. The real test came 8 weeks into the implementation when a video surfaced online showing a Pinnacle flight attendant questioning a young Asian woman's right to be in business class. The incident had occurred just days before the Jasmine initiative was announced, but the timing of the video's release created a potential public relations crisis. In the past, Pinnacle might have issued a bland statement about investigating the matter while quietly managing the issue behind the scenes. Instead, Jasmine Williams addressed it head-on in a video statement. The incident depicted in this video represents exactly the kind of behavior we are working to eliminate through the Jasmine initiative. The flight attendant involved has been identified and is currently undergoing our new training program. We've also reached out directly to the passenger to apologize and invite her to join our passenger advocacy board. The transparency was risky but effective. Rather than generating negative headlines, the response was praised as a model of corporate accountability. The passenger involved a medical student named Lisa Tanaka, not only accepted the apology, but agreed to participate in future training sessions, sharing her experience directly with staff. 3 months after the initiative's launch, Camila Rodriguez presented the preliminary results to Jasmine Williams in his Manhattan office. The numbers are promising. She reported sliding a tablet across his desk. Passenger complaints related to discriminatory treatment are down 64% across all routes. Staff engagement scores are up 27%, with the biggest improvements among those who initially seemed most resistant to change. Jackson nodded, pleased but not surprised. And the training program, we've now cycled 40% of our customer-facing staff through the full program. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, even from skeptics like Kevin Matthews. In fact, Camila added with a smile, Kevin has asked to be considered for a role as a training facilitator for future cohorts. That's significant, Jackson acknowledged. When your strongest critics become your advocates, you know you're making real progress. There's one other development you should be aware of, Camila continued. Several other airlines have reached out to inquire about licensing elements of our training program. United Skies and Transglobal have both expressed particular interest. Jackson leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. Competitors wanting to adopt our approach. I'd call that validation. So would I. Camila agreed, though some of the board members might question sharing our competitive advantage. This was never about competitive advantage, Jackson said firmly. It was about doing what's right and hopefully raising standards across the industry. Draft licensing terms that are fair but accessible. I want these practices to spread. As Camila left his office, Jackson turned to the framed photograph on his desk, Jasmine at her high school graduation, radiant with accomplishment and possibility. What had begun as a father's anger at his daughter's mistreatment had evolved into something far more significant, a fundamental reimagining of what air travel could and should be for every passenger. The Jasmine initiative wasn't just changing Pinnacle Airways, it was beginning to change the entire industry. And that, Jackson reflected, was a legacy worth building. The apartment was smaller than Morgan Bennett had ever imagined living in at this stage of her life, a one-bedroom unit in a modest building in Queens, far from the doorman-attended high-rise she had called home during her 22-year career with Pinnacle. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through them, a constant reminder of her diminished circumstances. 3 months had passed since her termination at Heathrow. 3 months of frantic job applications, dwindling savings, and growing desperation. Her impressive resume, 2 decades with a premier airline consistent performance ratings, specialized training in first-class service, had become radioactive in an industry where news traveled fast and HR departments conducted thorough background checks. She sat at her small kitchen table, scrolling through yet another rejection email from a regional carrier. While we appreciate your experience, we have decided to pursue other candidates whose qualifications better match our current needs. The carefully crafted corporate language couldn't disguise the underlying message. No one wanted to hire the flight attendant whose discriminatory behavior had launched a major industry initiative. Morgan closed her laptop and moved to the window, gazing out at the uninspiring view of the building across the street. How had everything unraveled so completely, so quickly? In her darkest moments, she still maintained that she had done nothing wrong, that she had simply been following protocol, protecting the premium cabin, maintaining standards. But as the weeks passed, as she watched news reports about the Jasmine initiative and read articles detailing the changes at Pinnacle, doubt had begun to creep in. The conversation she replayed most often in her mind wasn't the confrontation with Jasmine Williams or the termination meeting with Elizabeth Foster. It was a seemingly casual exchange from years earlier during a crew dinner in Singapore. A junior flight attendant had questioned why they automatically scrutinized younger passengers or casually dressed travelers in premium cabins. "Isn't that profiling?" the young woman had asked. Morgan had dismissed her concern with practiced confidence. "It's not profiling, it's pattern recognition. In 20 years, I've learned to spot who belongs and who doesn't. That's not bias, it's experience." The table had nodded in agreement. The question effectively silenced the junior attendant, absorbing the lesson that such concerns weren't welcome. And Morgan had felt validated, her approach endorsed by collective acceptance. Now, alone in her apartment, that memory carried a different weight. What she had confidently called pattern recognition, she now recognized as something else entirely, a set of assumptions and biases that she had not only embraced but actively taught to others. The realization wasn't sudden but gradual, seeping into her consciousness as she watched the world continue without her, as she saw Pinnacle Airways transform its practices and policies in direct response to her actions. One evening, as she prepared dinner, the doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence, since she rarely received visitors in her new neighborhood. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in her early 60s, smartly dressed in a simple pantsuit. "Who is it?" Morgan called. "My name is Diana Williams. I'd like to speak with you, Ms. Bennett." Morgan's heart lurched. Williams, the same last name as the girl on the plane as the CEO. What was this? Some kind of further humiliation or punishment? With trembling fingers, she opened the door, partway chain still in place. "What do you want?" The woman met her gaze steadily. "I'm Jasmine's mother. May I come in? I think we should talk." Against her better judgment, Morgan unlatched the chain and opened the door. Diana Williams entered with quiet dignity, declining Morgan's awkward offer of tea or coffee. "I'll be direct. Ms. Bennett," Diana said once they were seated in Morgan's small living room. "I'm not here on behalf of Pinnacle Airways or Jackson. They don't know I've come." "Then why are you here?" Morgan asked, genuinely confused. "Because I believe in restoration, not just punishment," Diana replied. "What you did to my daughter was wrong. The consequences you've faced are deserved. But I'm not interested in your continued suffering." Morgan's defenses rose immediately. "I don't need your pity." "This isn't pity," Diana cut in firmly. "This is an opportunity for you to actually learn from what happened, not just suffer for it." She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder. "I'm a professor of sociology at Columbia. I teach about structural inequalities and how they manifest in everyday interactions. I also serve on the board of the Center for Restorative Justice." She placed the folder on the coffee table between them. "This contains information about a program we run, a 6-week course that helps people understand the impact of biased behavior and develop new patterns of thinking and acting." Morgan stared at the folder without touching it. "And you think this will magically fix everything? Get me my job back. Make everyone forget what happened." "No," Diana said simply. "It won't do any of those things. Your actions have consequences that can't be undone. But it might help you understand why what happened happened and ensure you don't repeat those patterns in whatever comes next for you." "Why would you do this?" Morgan asked, suspicion edging her voice. "Why would you help the person who humiliated your daughter?" Diana's expression softened slightly. "Because my daughter is going to be fine. She has resources, support resilience. But the patterns of thinking that led you to treat her the way you did, those patterns hurt people every day who don't have Jasmine's advantages. If this program helps you recognize and change those patterns, then maybe the next young person of color you encounter won't face the same treatment." Morgan's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I've lost everything," she whispered. "You've lost a job," Diana corrected gently. "You still have your life, your mind, your capacity to change." She stood to leave, placing a business card on top of the folder. "The next session starts in 2 weeks. Think about it." After Diana left, Morgan sat staring at the folder for a long time, emotions churning within her. Part of her wanted to throw it in the trash to reject this unexpected and unwanted outreach. But another part, a quieter voice that had been growing stronger in these months of solitude and reflection, urged her to at least look at the information. With reluctant fingers, she opened the folder and began to read. The program was called Recognizing and Dismantling Bias, a Restorative Approach. It wasn't designed specifically for people like her who had faced public consequences for discriminatory actions. It was a general educational program for anyone seeking to understand and address their own biases. The description emphasized that the course wasn't about shame or blame, but about honest self-examination and practical tools for change. Participants would learn about the psychological and sociological roots of bias practice, recognizing their own biased thoughts, and develop strategies for making different choices in the future. Morgan closed the folder overwhelmed. The idea that Jasmine Williams's mother would seek her out not for retribution, but to offer a path toward genuine understanding was almost too much to process. Her phone chimed with a notification, another news article about the Jasmine Initiative, this one featuring an interview with a flight attendant named Kevin Matthews, describing how the new training had fundamentally changed his approach to passenger interactions. "I used to think I treated everyone equally," he was quoted saying. "But the training helped me recognize subtle biases in how I responded to different types of passengers. Now, I'm much more aware of making sure everyone feels genuinely welcomed, not just technically served." Morgan closed the article, a complex emotion rising within her. Not quite resentment, not quite regret, but something in between. Why was Kevin Matthews being celebrated for learning the lesson that had cost her everything? The answer, she knew deep down, was timing and attitude. He had been willing to learn, to change, to grow. She had dug in, defended, denied. After weeks of procrastination, Morgan finally did something she had been avoiding since her return to New York. She opened a blank document and began typing. "Dear Ms. Williams, you don't know me, though our brief interaction changed the course of both our lives. My name is Morgan Bennett, and I was the flight attendant who removed you from your seat on Pinnacle Flight PA-438 3 months ago." The letter took hours to compose each sentence, requiring careful consideration. It wasn't a simple apology. It couldn't be given the complexity of what had happened and its far-reaching consequences. It was an attempt to articulate a journey from certainty to doubt, from defensiveness to reflection. "I won't claim that I've completely transformed my thinking," she wrote toward the end. "Change doesn't happen that quickly or easily. But I am beginning to understand how my actions affected you and others like you over the years. I'm starting to see what I couldn't or wouldn't see before. This letter isn't a request for forgiveness or understanding. You owe me neither. It's simply an acknowledgement of harm done and lessons belatedly learned." She signed it, printed it, and addressed an envelope to Jasmine Williams, care of Pinnacle Airways headquarters. Whether it would reach her or not, whether she would read it or discard it unread, Morgan couldn't know. But the act of writing it felt necessary, a small step toward honest reckoning with what she had done and who she had been. 2 days later, Morgan received a call from a hiring manager at Hudson River Ferries, a company that provided commuter and tourist services along the Hudson. The position was for a customer service representative, a significant step down in both status and salary from her flight attendant role. But at this point, any opportunity was welcome. "Your airline experience is impressive," the manager said, "but I have to ask about the gap in your employment record." Morgan took a deep breath. She had prepared for this question, rehearsing various ways to frame her departure from Pinnacle without outright lying, but without revealing the full story either. But in that moment, standing in her small kitchen with the weight of the past 3 months pressing down on her, she made a different choice. "I was terminated from Pinnacle Airways for discriminatory behavior toward a passenger," she said simply. "I made assumptions based on how someone looked, and those assumptions were wrong. It cost me my career, but more importantly, it caused real harm to another person." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably. "That's unusually candid," the manager finally responded. Most candidates would try to put a more favorable spin on that situation. "I've tried that approach in dozens of interviews," Morgan admitted. "It hasn't worked. And honestly, I'm tired of pretending this didn't happen or that it wasn't significant." There was another pause before the manager spoke again. "We'll need to discuss this with our team, but I appreciate your honesty. It says something about where you are now, even if it doesn't erase what happened." The call ended without a clear outcome, and Morgan had little expectation that it would lead to anything positive. But for the first time in months, she felt the faintest sense of forward movement, not redemption, not restoration, but perhaps the beginning of a different kind of journey. That evening, as she prepared a simple dinner in her modest kitchen, she found herself reflecting on a question that had haunted her since Heathrow. If she had known who Jasmine Williams was, if she had recognized her as the CEO's daughter, would she have acted differently? The answer she had to acknowledge was yes. She would have welcomed Jasmine with the same effusive courtesy she extended to all passengers she perceived as important or powerful. And that realization contained the essence of what she had failed to understand throughout her career. Dignity shouldn't be a function of status or connection. It shouldn't depend on wearing the right clothes or having the right name or looking the part. It should simply be the baseline, the starting point, the minimum standard for how human beings interact with one another. 2 weeks later, Morgan Bennett walked into a classroom at the Center for Restorative Justice, the folder Diana Williams had given her tucked under her arm. She chose a seat near the back, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and something else, something that felt cautiously like hope. The instructor, a middle-aged black woman with a warm smile and perceptive eyes, began by asking each participant to share why they had come. When Morgan's turn arrived, she took a deep breath. "My name is Morgan Bennett," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "And I'm here because I finally realized that I've been looking at people through the wrong lens for most of my life. I want to learn to see differently." It wasn't forgiveness or redemption or a neat resolution. It was just a beginning, the first step on what would be a long and often difficult journey. But as the instructor nodded encouragingly and gestured for the next person to speak, Morgan felt something inside her shift, slightly like a door, long stuck, finally beginning to open. Morgan Bennett had learned this lesson at tremendous personal cost. Whether she could translate that costly education into a meaningful change in how she moved through the world remained to be seen. But as the class began in earnest, she felt for the first time since that fateful flight the faint possibility that her story wasn't over, that it might yet contain chapters of growth, understanding, and eventual redemption. 3 days after the first class session, Morgan received a call from Hudson River Ferries. To her surprise, they offered her the customer service position. "Your honesty about your past impressed our team," the manager explained. "We believe in giving people a second chance when they demonstrate genuine accountability." It wasn't the glamorous international career she had built over 2 decades, but it was a start, an opportunity to practice the new awareness she was developing in a direct customer service role. And on her 4th day at the ferry terminal, as she helped an elderly Chinese couple who spoke limited English navigate the ticketing process, treating them with the same care and attention she would have given a corporate executive, Morgan realized something had indeed shifted within her. The lens through which she viewed others was gradually changing, becoming clearer, more humane. She never heard back from Jasmine Williams. The letter she had sent might have been discarded unread, or it might have made some small difference. Morgan would never know, and she came to understand that not knowing was part of her journey too, learning to do the right thing without the guarantee of forgiveness or recognition. The path forward wouldn't be easy or straightforward. Old habits of thought still surfaced, requiring conscious effort to redirect. But with each day, each interaction, each choice to see people first as human beings, rather than as classifications, Morgan Bennett was slowly building a new foundation for whatever came next. The conference room on the 52nd floor of Pinnacle Airways Manhattan headquarters offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, the afternoon sun glinting off glass and steel. Around the polished table sat members of the Pinnacle Foundation Board executives, community leaders, and education advocates who oversaw the company's philanthropic initiatives. At the head of the table stood Jasmine Williams, now 18, and in her first semester at Columbia University's architecture program. Despite her youth, she carried herself with quiet confidence as she advanced to the next slide in her presentation. "The data is clear," she explained, gesturing to the graph displayed on the screen. "Access to international travel and cultural exchange dramatically increases educational outcomes for students from underserved communities. Yet these are precisely the students least likely to have such opportunities." Jackson Williams watched his daughter from his seat at the opposite end of the table, pride evident in his expression. When Jasmine had first approached him about presenting her idea to the foundation board, he had offered to champion it for her. She had politely declined, insisting on making the case herself. "What I'm proposing," Jasmine continued, advancing to a slide titled Architecture of Opportunity, is a comprehensive scholarship program that would provide international travel experiences specifically tailored to students interested in design architecture and urban planning. She outlined the program structure: fully funded summer study programs abroad for high school and college students from low-income backgrounds, mentorship connections with professionals in their fields of interest, and ongoing support through a community of fellow scholars. The preliminary budget for a pilot program serving 20 students would be approximately $1.2 million, she concluded. This includes travel expenses, program fees, stipends for living costs, and administrative overhead. As Jasmine fielded questions from the board members addressing concerns about selection criteria, program logistics, and measurable outcomes, Jackson remained silent, allowing her to navigate the discussion without his intervention. Finally, Gabriela Hernandez, who served on both the corporate and foundation boards, posed the question that had been hovering unspoken. "Jasmine, this is clearly a thoughtful and worthwhile proposal. But I have to ask, is this connected to your experience on Flight PA438? Is this a response to what happened to you?" Jasmine considered the question carefully before responding. "Yes and no," she said finally. "That experience certainly informed my thinking about access and belonging. But this isn't about me or what happened on that flight." She gestured toward the window to the city beyond. "It's about the thousands of young people out there with talent and potential who may never experience the world beyond their neighborhoods, not because they lack ability or interest, but because they lack opportunity, and crucially, because they don't see themselves reflected in these fields. My experience on that flight was unpleasant, but it was momentary. I knew I belonged in that seat regardless of what anyone thought. But what about the young person who's never been told they belong in architecture, in design, in any space dominated by voices and perspectives different from their own? That's who this program is for." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Jackson, watching the expressions around the table shift from polite interest to genuine engagement, knew his daughter had won them over, not through his influence, but through her own clarity of vision and purpose. After a brief deliberation, the board voted unanimously to approve the pilot program with a commitment to evaluate expansion based on first-year outcomes. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out with congratulatory words for Jasmine, Jackson approached his daughter. "That was impressive," he said simply. "You didn't need my help at all." Jasmine smiled. "I learned from the best, and I had good material to work with. The research from my Oxford project really strengthened the proposal." "I'm matching the foundation's commitment personally," Jackson told her. "That's not the CEO speaking. That's your dad. I believe in what you're building here." The program, officially named the Architecture of Opportunity Scholarship, launched with its inaugural cohort 6 months later. The selection process had been rigorous but holistic, identifying 20 students with demonstrated interest in design fields and significant financial need. The announcement event, held in a community center in the Bronx, rather than Pinnacle's corporate headquarters, reflected the program's focus on accessibility and inclusion. The 20 selected scholars, ranging in age from 16 to 20, gathered with family members, mentors, and program administrators to celebrate this life-changing opportunity. Jasmine, who had insisted on a limited role in the public-facing aspects of the program to avoid overshadowing the scholars, stood quietly at the back of the room as Jackson addressed the gathering. "When my daughter first presented this idea to our foundation board," he began, "she spoke about access and opportunity, about opening doors that have historically been closed to too many talented young people. But what struck me most was her understanding that opportunity isn't just about financial resources. It's about belonging, about seeing yourself reflected in spaces and fields where you've been told directly or indirectly that you don't fit." He gestured to the 20 scholars seated in the front rows. "Each of you has already demonstrated remarkable talent and determination. This program isn't charity. It's investment in the future of design architecture, and ultimately in the future of how we all experience the built environment around us." Following the formal presentations, Jasmine circulated among the scholars, engaging them in conversations about their interests and aspirations. One young woman, Alicia Rodriguez, approached her with barely contained excitement. "I still can't believe this is happening," Alicia confessed, clutching the program materials. "I've dreamed about studying sustainable urban design in Copenhagen since I was 14, but I never thought it would actually be possible." "What drew you to sustainable design?" Jasmine asked, genuinely curious. "I grew up in public housing," Alicia explained. "Our building was always too hot in summer, freezing in winter, with poor air quality and high utility bills. I started researching better approaches and discovered this whole world of sustainable design that could transform how people like my family live." As Jasmine listened to Alicia's passion and vision, she felt a profound sense of purpose. This was the real power of what they were building, not just sending students abroad, but nurturing voices and perspectives that would transform these fields from within. The program's impact extended beyond the individual scholars. Partner institutions in London, Barcelona, Tokyo, and other global design centers began developing more inclusive approaches to their own programs. Mentors reported that their interactions with the scholars had challenged and expanded their own thinking about design and accessibility. 1 year after its launch, the Architecture of Opportunity Scholarship was featured in major design and education publications. Applications for the second cohort tripled, and several other corporations approached the Pinnacle Foundation about creating similar initiatives in different fields. For Jasmine, watching the program grow beyond her initial vision was both gratifying and humbling. What had begun as a personal response to a moment of exclusion had evolved into something far more significant, a sustainable structure for creating genuine inclusion. During a mentorship event at Columbia University, where several of the scholars were paired with established architects, Thomas Blackwell approached Jasmine with evident admiration. "You've created something remarkable here," he observed. "When we met in that VIP suite at Heathrow, I never imagined this would be the outcome." Jasmine smiled. "Neither did I, honestly. But that's the thing about architecture and about life, I suppose. Sometimes the most challenging sites produce the most innovative designs." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Morgan Bennett tried to define where you belonged based on how you looked. Instead, you've redefined belonging itself for an entire generation of designers." As the scholars and mentors engaged in animated discussions around them, Jasmine reflected on the journey from seat 47E to this moment. Morgan Bennett had questioned her place in first class, but in doing so had inadvertently helped her find her true place, not just as a passenger or even as an architect, but as someone who could fundamentally reshape how access and opportunity were distributed. And that Jasmine realized was the ultimate form of belonging, not fitting into spaces others had designed, but creating new spaces where everyone could belong. The familiar chime of the boarding announcement echoed through Heathrow's Terminal 5 as Jasmine Williams joined the queue for Pinnacle Airways flight PA 438 to New York. 1 year had passed since that fateful journey in the opposite direction, a year of transformation growth and unexpected impact. Now, a sophomore at Columbia, Jasmine had returned to London to evaluate the first international cohort of her scholarship program and to deliver a guest lecture at Oxford on design as radical inclusion. The trip had been a resounding success, but she was ready to return home, her sketchbook filled with new ideas and observations. As she approached the boarding area, she noticed the subtle but significant changes implemented under the Jasmine Initiative. The boarding announcements emphasized that passengers could board when their group was called, regardless of whether they looked the part for their cabin class, a direct response to the profiling that had occurred a year earlier. The gate agents made eye contact with each passenger, their interactions warm and genuine rather than perfunctory. Most notably, a small placard displayed the dignity pledge that had become standard throughout Pinnacle operations. Every passenger, every journey treated with respect. Jasmine presented her boarding pass first-class seat 2A, just like before, to the gate agent, a young woman whose name badge identified her as Sophia. "Welcome, Ms. Williams," Sophia said with a smile of recognition. "It's an honor to have you on board today." Jasmine returned the smile, appreciating the acknowledgement, but also noting that Sophia was greeting every passenger with similar warmth regardless of their destination in the aircraft. As she settled into her seat, the same one Morgan Bennett had tried to deny her a year ago, Jasmine felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle was closing. The first-class cabin looked the same with its spacious seats and premium amenities, but the atmosphere felt subtly different, more inclusive, less exclusive. A flight attendant approached young Hispanic with a name badge reading Marco Santos. Jasmine recognized him immediately as the junior attendant who had brought her amenities in economy class during that difficult flight. "Ms. Williams," he said, his eyes lighting with recognition. "I was hoping I'd have the chance to serve you properly this time." "Marco," she replied warmly. "I never got to properly thank you for your kindness last year. It meant more than you know." He shook his head slightly. "No thanks necessary. I just did what anyone should have done, but not what everyone would have done," she pointed out. "I understand you've been promoted." Marco nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "Senior cabin crew now and part of the training team for the Jasmine Initiative. It's been transformative, not just for the airline, but for me personally." As Marco continued with his pre-flight duties, Jasmine noticed a young man boarding barely 20, wearing worn jeans and a hoodie, carrying a battered guitar case. He glanced at his boarding pass with evident nervousness, clearly uncertain about whether he was in the right place. Marco approached him immediately. First time in first class, he asked, his tone friendly and welcoming. The young man nodded, visibly relieved at the absence of judgment in Marco's manner. "Well, you're in exactly the right place," Marco assured him, helping him stow his guitar in a safe location. "Seat 3B, right over there. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" Jasmine watched this interaction with quiet satisfaction. A year ago, that young musician might have faced the same scrutiny and suspicion she had encountered. Today, he was being welcomed with the same respect and courtesy extended to every passenger. As the cabin filled, Thomas Blackwell arrived, taking his seat across the aisle from Jasmine. They had maintained a professional connection over the past year, with Thomas serving as both an advisor to the Architecture of Opportunity Scholarship and a vocal advocate for the Jasmine Initiative within the broader business community. "Feels a bit like déjà vu, doesn't it?" he commented as he settled in. "Same flight, same seats, but a very different atmosphere." "Night and day," Jasmine agreed. "And not just in visible ways. Did you see the quarterly report my father released yesterday?" Thomas nodded. "Impressive numbers. Passenger satisfaction up 28% overall, with the most significant gains among younger travelers and people of color." Staff retention improved by 15%, and most tellingly, bias-related complaints down by nearly 70%. And all that while maintaining profitability, Jasmine added. Which matters, because it means these changes are sustainable. The aircraft began its pushback from the gate, the engine's gentle rumble signaling the beginning of their journey home. As they taxied toward the runway, Jasmine opened her tablet to review notes from her Oxford lecture. The title slide displayed a rendering of her latest design concept, a public space explicitly created to welcome diverse users with flexible configurations that accommodated different needs without segregation or special accommodation. You know, Thomas said thoughtfully, glancing at her screen when most people experience discrimination. The best outcome they can hope for is an apology and perhaps some compensation. You've managed to transform an individual wrong into institutional change. That's remarkable. Jasmine considered his words. It wasn't just me. It was my father's willingness to listen and act. It was people like you and Marco choosing to speak up rather than stay silent. It was the thousands of passengers who had experienced similar treatment but never had a platform to share their stories. True, Thomas acknowledged. But it still started with you, with your dignity in that moment and your vision afterward. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, lifting smoothly into the London sky, Jasmine gazed out at the city below, growing smaller as they climbed. She thought about the young scholarship recipients she had just met, each with their own dreams and potential. She thought about Marco Santos, transformed from a hesitant junior attendant to a confident leader. She thought about the young musician with his guitar, welcomed without question into a space where he might once have been challenged. And yes, she even thought about Morgan Bennett, wondering where she was and whether she had found a path forward after that catastrophic error in judgment. Jasmine had received her letter 6 months earlier, not a request for forgiveness, but an acknowledgement of harm done and lessons learned. She hadn't responded, feeling that the letter itself was complete in its purpose without requiring further exchange. What had begun as a humiliating experience in Seat 47E had catalyzed changes that now touched thousands of lives daily. The Jasmine initiative had spread beyond Pinnacle Airways, with elements of its training and accountability practices being adopted by competitors across the industry. The architecture of Opportunity Scholarship was preparing to welcome its third cohort, with an expanded focus on underrepresented voices in design fields globally. All because one flight attendant had looked at a young black woman and decided she didn't belong in first class. As the aircraft leveled at cruising altitude, Marco approached with a warm towel and a genuine smile. "Comfortable, Ms. Williams?" "Perfectly, thank you," she replied. "And please call me Jasmine." "Jasmine," he repeated with a nod of respect. "Welcome aboard. It's an honor to have you flying with us." The simple greeting, the one she should have received a year earlier, carried the weight of everything that had changed. Not just policies or procedures, but hearts and minds. Not just a seat assignment, but a fundamental understanding of what dignity meant in practice. Jasmine settled back in Seat 2A, exactly where she belonged. Not because of who her father was, or what she wore, or how she looked, but simply because that was the seat she had chosen, the journey she had embarked upon, the space she had claimed as her own. And in that claiming, she had opened the door for countless others to do the same. Conclusion. The legacy of flight. PA 438 wasn't confined to corporate policies or training manuals. It lived in the confident stride of Alicia Rodriguez as she presented her sustainable housing design to urban planners in Copenhagen. It resonated in the voice of Marco Santos as he coached new flight attendants to recognize and challenge their unconscious biases. It flourished in the innovative structures Jasmine Williams was beginning to design, buildings that didn't just accommodate diversity, but celebrated and elevated it. What Morgan Bennett had intended as an act of exclusion had instead sparked a movement toward genuine inclusion. The Jasmine Initiative had become more than a corporate program. It was now a benchmark for how organizations could transform culture from within, replacing unexamined traditions with thoughtful, intentional practices that honored the dignity of every individual. As Jasmine's plane soared across the Atlantic, she opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and began to draw not just another building, but a vision of a world where belonging wasn't determined by appearance or assumptions, where spaces welcomed rather than excluded, where dignity wasn't a privilege but a right. Her pencil moved with purpose across the paper, sketching not just what was but what could be a design for a future, where no one would ever again be told they didn't belong in the seat they had rightfully claimed. If this powerful story about dignity bias and transformation resonated with you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue to bring meaningful stories like Flight Attendant Denies Black Girl First Class to viewers around the world. By sharing this content, you're helping to spark important conversations about belonging, respect, and inclusion in everyday spaces. These are discussions we all need to be having regardless of our backgrounds or experiences. Subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking narratives that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Your engagement matters. It tells us what stories connect with you and helps us create content that makes a difference. Remember, change begins with awareness. Together, we can build a world where everyone belongs. Thank you for watching.